Welcome to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. I'm your host, Dori Pham. Join me and my fellow public policy classmates as we explore potential policy solutions for today's most pressing societal challenges.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Assemblymember Jackson. We are truly so excited to have you here today on the Policy Chats podcast. As a dedicated public servant and advocate, your career has been marked by a deep commitment to uplifting marginalized communities. From your early days as a student leader at CSU San Bernardino, to becoming the founder and CEO of SBX Youth and Family Services, where you have worked tirelessly to break cycles of poverty and violence, you've been at the forefront of driving meaningful change. In 2022, you were recently elected to the California State Assembly, where you've continued your advocacy serving as chair of the Human Services Committee, as well as leading the Budget Subcommittee number 2 on Human Services. Your work has led to significant policy reforms, including efforts to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline and protect youth from harmful and unconstitutional probation practices. Your leadership in addressing systemic inequities, particularly in juvenile justice and affordable housing, has been instrumental in shaping policies that impact vulnerable communities across California. So today we are eager to dive into your experiences in public service in both the nonprofit and government sectors, your work advocating for systemic change, and to talk about some policies that are going to be shaping the future of California. So thank you so much.
Good to be here.
It's amazing. So getting started right off the bat, you are the founder, as I mentioned, of SBX Youth and Family Services, which focuses on breaking that cycle of poverty and violence through mentoring, education, and community organizing. So what inspired you to pursue this line of work and really start SBX Youth and Family Services?
Well, first, I think that when I was in my 17, 18, 19-year-old phase, I realized that I just wasn't happy unless I had some type of service in my life. And as a young person, I would always just say yes to everything. And as a matter of fact, I say yes to so many things. My mom would always tell me, so when are you going to ever get paid for this stuff, right? But it gave me that idea that when you start people young with community services and getting involved in their community, it stays with them for their entire life. And I think that's really what has kept me on this journey. As a young person, I'm a product of a single mother who, by the time I was getting up for school, she was on her way to bed because she worked night shifts as a nurse. And which means that school and community was my second home, really. But also that means I was raised by a village here in the Inland Empire, and I grew up in Rialto. And there was an organization that was a mentoring program for young men at Rialto High School called Sigma Beta. And those of us who grew up and were mentored by that organization realized that we wanted to give other young people the same mentoring opportunities and experiences that we had when we were growing up. And so we, out of a lot of fits and starts, probably by the time I was 30, I actually knew what the heck I was doing in this life. And I decided to live off my savings for 2 years to start SBX Youth and Family Services. And so I had a time in my 20s when I was doing government relations work and worked in state government and federal government. And I said, I have one more big risk in me. And so I said, I'm going to do everything I can to start SBX Youth and Family Services. The gamble paid off, and I was able to run it for a little over a decade, where we started off with just mentoring programs for young men, just like we had an opportunity to do. And now it has grown to a multi-million-dollar organization with over 40 employees, and it's still alive even after I left to continue the mission.
Wow, that is amazing how to hear, your story growing up. But to shift things a little bit, throughout your career, you've worked to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline, challenging, unconstitutional probation practices, and protecting the youth from punitive measures for non-criminal behavior. Can you explain the impact of the school-to-prison pipeline and why efforts like yours are so critical?
Absolutely. We have to realize, what we realized in SBX was that not just mentoring a young person does a lot of good, but that's not all, right? There are micro, meso, and macro influences on a young person's life. So you have the interactions on the micro level, but then you have the meso level, which all that means is the groups that a young person finds themselves in, right? And the communities that they find themselves in. And then the macro sense is the systems that they interact with. And in many cases, young people are in unhealthy systems, which causes them to fall into unhealthy behaviors that may not even be in the fault of their own, but actually it's because adults allow systems to exist that pushes them into certain directions. So the school-to-prison pipeline just says this, is that when young people are in unhealthy communities and they are living in families or households that are in survival mode, then that may cause them to have behaviors at the school level that may cause them to not follow norms that are acceptable to the school. So then school create policies not to help young people, but to punish young people into trying to make it painful for them to veer off of the norms, to hopefully make them follow it by force in many ways. So then they create these zero tolerance policies that doesn't allow them to learn from mistakes, but punishes them for mistakes, which leads to a lot of suspensions and expulsions. And the more that they're pushed away and sent home from suspensions and expulsions, the more that schools are basically saying you're not welcomed here. And so young people say, fine then, I don't want to be here anyway. And then they end up being in communities unsupervised. And then they fall into other behaviors and fall into law enforcement that gets them on that school-to-prison pipeline along the way. So the question is, what can systems do to push people away from the school-to-prison pipeline as opposed to welcoming them and finding more places for them to be in juvenile halls and other things? All that to say is SBX found out that the Riverside County was falling into harmful practices that was promoting the school-to-prison pipeline. And through our legal actions, working with the ACLU, we were able to shut down an on-ramp to the school-to-prison pipeline.
That is amazing. I think it's truly, it baffles me so much that, a lot of when you talk about some policy solutions to incarceration and to preventing people from even ending up where they're being in contact with the criminal legal system, education is such a key factor. Mm-hmm. And then to have something where education is now with the school-to-prison pipeline almost contributing to that.
Absolutely.
It's such a almost horrifying thing to think about. Mm-hmm. So I think the work that you're doing is truly amazing, and to turn your experiences into something that you can use to help people even beyond what you had experienced growing up.
Absolutely.
So, kind of speaking more broadly about this youth incarceration, as a legislator, you've done significant work to address these systemic inequities within the juvenile justice system. How can work such as yours to, for example, help seal juvenile records, shield these youth from the collateral consequences of conviction, which we know can be very costly?
Right. In our Constitution, it is meant to say that once you serve your time, it's over. You can become a productive member of society. Unfortunately, that's not what our laws do. And unfortunately, it's created by a lot of intentional policies to continue to marginalize and oppress populations. And so many of our laws make it so that once you serve your time and you're off of probation, you're still serving what's really a life sentence of barriers and obstacles based upon what's on your record. And so a couple of things that I've done in my life, both not just in legislatively, but also during the time of George Floyd, where we pushed, working with the NAACP, to declare racism a public health issue, and to be able to make sure that counties, Riverside County is looking at all of its policies and all of its systems to root out racist systemic practices, right? And then legislatively, how do you continue that work? And that is, that bill is a big deal that the governor signed to say that young people do stupid things. Young people are supposed to do stupid things. Why? Because that's how they learn. And many of us have done stupid things, childish things when we were young. We just weren't caught, right? So how do we create systems where young people can make mistakes in safe environments? And after they've made that mistakes, and sometimes it may have been based upon breaking laws, but once you're done being a young person, how can you have a fresh start so that you're not impeded from getting your education, impeded from getting financial aid, impeded from getting a job, right? So that you are less likely to go back into criminal behavior because doing it the right way is not working for you. And so all this is to say that bill was intended to making sure that young people have a fresh start when they become 18, and that their criminal record does not have to become a life sentence for them, and so that they can break out of systems and cycles of poverty and crime and homelessness and a whole host of other things that may come from that.
I mean, you said it perfectly. And I wanted to share, I had an experience, I think it was a year or two ago at our Civil Rights Institute downtown. We were at a housing policy panel, and there was a speaker there, and he was telling me a story before the event began. And it was truly heartbreaking hearing how he was 17, he made some mistakes, he didn't have the greatest upbringing, and he ended up incarcerated, served his time, came out, turned his life around despite all of these collateral consequences that he had to face. And he said, now here I am 20, 30 years later, and I can't live in a city with a school district for my kids to go to get a good quality education due to crime-free housing policies. And it just baffled me to think that someone who, was very briefly incarcerated, turned his life around, got his PhD in criminology, gave his time back to his community, doing literally everything in his power to make the world a better place. And he couldn't even live in a city where his kids could get a good education, which is going to, with these cycles of poverty and recidivism, it's not going to necessarily help them. And so I just, hearing that story really inspired me to pursue the criminal legal system and try to understand all of these systemic inequities that are happening. And so what you were sharing reminded me of that.
I think the best thing policymakers can do, and people who are in the public policy space can do, is look at the most prevalent issues. Obviously, we have housing issues. We have homelessness issues. We have cycles of crime issues. We have education issues. The first thing we should think about is, what laws are we enforcing that's actually contributing to the issues we're trying to solve ourselves, right? Because in many cases, we still have to unravel a lot of old policies that are grounded in racism, that's grounded in xenophobia, that's grounded in Eurocentric hegemonic practices that we have to understand are actually causing the very issues we are trying to solve or we're concerned about. And then how do we replace that with healthier policies, more forward-thinking policies, to ensure that we're not just dealing with the issues of today, but we're setting up the next generation.
Hi,
Hi everyone, I'm excited to share that this year marks the 10th anniversary of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. Since our founding in 2015, the school has been committed to provide solutions for the region, solutions for the world. Over the past decade, we've worked to promote public policies that advance efficiency, equity, prosperity, and justice. Our 10-year anniversary theme is creating a thriving, prosperous, and abundant world, and we'll be hosting a series of events, guest speakers, and podcast episodes to celebrate our milestone. Keep an eye out for our upcoming events by visiting spp10years.ucr.edu and join us in celebrating a decade of research, education, and impactful contributions to the Riverside community and beyond. That's amazing. Thank you so much for your insight. And just speaking of on housing, a few weeks ago at a recent Assembly Budget Subcommittee hearing on human services, you emphasized the importance of uplifting vulnerable communities and ensuring that essential needs in the past also have access to essential needs. And in the past, you have also emphasized the urgent need to address, California's affordable housing, calling it an immediate crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And can you elaborate on the specific challenges your constituents are facing in terms of housing affordability, and share any ongoing policy that that you are aware of?
Sure. I think you have to, if you go back since even before the pandemic, we were having housing issues, we were having affordability issues, the whole deal. Then the pandemic happened, and then that just exploded especially as soon as society opened up again, right? Which means we start to see a whole lot of continued instability. When too many people become engaged in survival mode and crisis mode, a lot of bad things happen. And a part of what contributes to being in survival mode is having to pay more than 50% of your income on housing. And then on top of that, rising utility bills. Then on top of that, inflationary pressures in terms of basic goods, right? And so the number one responsibility of government, and my number one North Star, is how you get enough people out of crisis mode and keep them out of crisis mode. Because when crisis mode happens, it takes a whole lot more money to get them out of crisis mode than it does to keep them stable. And of course, Maslow's law of hierarchy of needs, right? The idea is, do people have stable housing? Do we keep people out of food insecurity? And do we allow people to meet their basic needs in terms of food, water, and housing? Once that happens, what are some things we can do to allow them to stay stable so they can chart their own course in terms of what it means for them to be able to thrive? And of course, housing is one of those core things to be able to do that. And a lot of the most successful housing programs we are seeing are actually funded from pandemic dollars that are fading away. And so now the question becomes, what are we going to do? What does the data says are our most effective programs that have been able to keep people out of housing and get them into housing and keep them into housing? And so a number of those programs in my jurisdiction are actually through our CalWorks program. Federally, they call it the TANF program, right? And so what does that mean? That means that when people are in CalWorks, we started to see that when people are even on CalWorks and CalFresh, our social safety net programs, and WIC programs, that they were still falling into homelessness, which means that's not really a social safety net, a good social safety net program. And so what we did with the pandemic dollars is we started to incorporate employment programs, but also housing programs, to making sure that they had access to not make sure they're not falling into homelessness. So now our biggest challenge is, how do we find the state dollars necessary to keep those federally funded programs alive, because those federal dollars are now coming to an end?
And I think you bring up an issue that we've heard so many times here on the podcast, unfortunately, that in, these moments of crisis, like the pandemic, you can see this flow of money to places that need it the most, that, in a perfect world would have had them in a more preparatory manner. Mm-hmm. And we were speaking, I think, most recently with the Director of Public Health for Riverside County. And she was saying a lot of the dollars that she got in the pandemic to help prevent disease spread are now fading away. And even though the pandemic isn't there, people still have issues with housing, and people still, we still don't want to spread any infectious diseases.
Yeah.
And so I think it's definitely an important issue that you bring up about making sure that funding isn't just a crisis response, but something that's sustained so that we can get people out of that crisis mode themselves.
Absolutely. A perfect example is Riverside County Public Health leadership came to me last year to say, the governor's proposing that we dismantle all the infrastructure that we built up in terms of public health, right? And so we scrambled in the legislature to say, no, we made great strides, great best practices when it comes to public health, social safety net programs, and immigrant assistance programs, right? Great infrastructure that we set up. And now the question is, are we going to just allow that to crumble? And then when we're in our next crisis, which is going to happen, we're going to have more pandemics. We're going to have more natural disasters, right? All of those things are going to happen more frequently now, whether it's due to climate change or growing global interconnectivity. It's just going to happen. So we need to make sure that we are being more far-sighted instead of short-sighted, and doing whatever it takes to maintain the infrastructure, because there's no doubt that we're going to need it in the future.
100%. I think, exactly what you said, being more far-sighted instead of short-sighted when it comes to responses. I know we're running a little bit low on time here, so kind of the last final two questions.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, given your experience working with SBX Youth and Family Services, and now as a California legislature, what role can collaborations between governments and nonprofit organizations, and maybe it does play into that funding aspect, play in creating this effective change that we need?
I really call this a resilience strategy. We cannot forget all of the public policies and programs that we set up for the pandemic and the lessons we learned. And there are some key lessons that we learned on what we need to ensure that we have more resilient communities. Again, resiliency is about when hard times come, your ability to withstand those, your ability to quickly recover from those things. A couple of things. Number one, you cannot have resiliency without a proper child care system. Number two, we need to make sure that we have a strong and robust nonprofit sector to be able to ensure that resources and information is equitably distributed throughout communities, because they are the trusted messengers and they have the specialty to reach hard to reach populations, particularly those that are distrustful from government programs and government agencies, right? And so the idea is that government must continue to invest in nonprofit infrastructure so that when governments cannot do something, when governments have to shut down, when governments fail, nonprofits are there to be seamless in our approaches to rapidly attack the issues of the day.
Thank you so much. I think that is an amazing place to end. And, to tie it all together, all of these things we've talked about today, incarceration, youth incarceration especially, housing and homelessness, affordability, all of these things are interconnected. And, for better or worse, these policies all impact each other. And I think exactly what you said, going into creating a shift of mindset, looking more in the long term, building resilient communities, resilient policies, where even when we do have those instances where government lags behind, those other nonprofits or organizations can fill in those gaps. So with that, I want to thank you so much for all the work you've been doing in both sectors, continuing to dedicate your time advocating for your communities and communities even beyond that. And, it's been such an honor to speak with you and learn from your insights. So thank you so much for joining us.
It's been great to be with both of you, and well done.
Thank you for listening to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us on Instagram at UCR_SPP. To learn more about our program and upcoming episodes, visit spp.ucr.edu. For the video version of this episode, check out our YouTube channel at UCR School of Public Policy. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.